how can you write about the 20th century and call yourself a historian if you don't actually face up to this appalling central calamity and how it has affected women? And it has affected women in myriad ways. But Hilda had the guts, the courage to go back into block 12, the music block, and take the notebook and diary and a volume of Faust that had belonged to Alma Rosé, the conductor I mentioned, contradicting Nazi orders. She could have been shot on the spot, but she did it. She had that historical foresight because she said nobody will believe that this happened. Look at what did motivate these women to keep going, because that was one of the things I wanted to try and understand. And there are different motivations. One of them wanted revenge on the people who had betrayed her family. One of them wanted to bear witness to the next generation. One of them wanted to tell her parents who were in hiding what had happened to their son, her brother, and he died, and she felt she had to survive for that. Anita wanted to live for music. She said whatever else the Nazis did, they can't kill music. So there are different reasons for living, but I think they all said they just wanted to survive till the next day, one day at a time.
Welcome everyone to How to Have Extraordinary Relationships podcast. I'm delighted today to be here with author and historian Anne Sebba. She's written so many books. She's written That Woman, we're talking about That Woman #1, not Meghan. We're talking about Wallis Simpson. She's also written about Jenny Churchill, Laura Ashley, Edith Bagnold, Ethel Rosenberg, Mother Teresa, women in Paris Les Parisiennes, based in the 1940s, and her latest book is The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. So huge books on big subjects. Women seem to be at the centre of it. So welcome, Anne. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Lucy. It's such a pleasure to talk to you of all people. So I'm delighted to be here.
So I thought we'd start by your latest book because it's just come out now. I've got it. It's brilliant. It's very moving. So would you like to tell us a bit more about the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz?
Oh, I'll try. Of course, as soon as you mention the word Auschwitz, people think, oh, this is so grim, this is so ghastly. I'm not sure I could ever go there. But actually, the subtitle is A Story of Survival. And I really wanted to make that clear that actually, I think this is a book that ends on an upbeat. So although of course Auschwitz is terrible, and I don't want to diminish the suffering and the pain and the ghastliness of what the Nazis tried to do, but my story is about a group of women between 40 and 50 who survived by playing music, not music as we think of it. It was a perversion of music. It was a Nazi tool, but they had to play, and they saw it as a means of survival. And this group of women with ages ranging from 15 to 56, 11 nations, several religions, certainly 50-50 Christian and Jewish, but even amongst the Jewish group, some were Zionists, some were agnostic, some were assimilated. So a great variety. And yet, when push came to shove, they pulled together. And that, I think, was what really intrigued me, this sisterhood, these small acts of kindness, perhaps sharing food, not always. I mean, that's at the heart of it. There were squabbles and arguments over food. Of course there were. These women were starving and freezing and terrified. But also, they looked after each other, small friendship groups. So, for example, the 3 Belgian women stuck together, mothers and daughters, sisters. Polish women were a group of about 5 or sometimes 6, and they helped each other. And that, I think, is what I found so fascinating, that these small groups were all that they needed. Possibly you only needed one other person to say, buck up, don't give in, there will be hope. And actually, that was the word that I think I ended with, because although I don't believe these orchestra women really had much in the way of privileges, perhaps we'll talk about that, they had a few, but really to talk about privileges in Auschwitz is so ridiculous in ordinary life. But the big privilege they did have was hope that they might survive. And I think I've learned so much. I mean, what a privilege it is to be an author and get under the skin of these ghastly situations and try and understand, what makes the human spirit tick. Why did these women want to live when they'd seen their family destroyed, when they'd seen the worst that humanity was capable of? I sometimes think, well, I'd just give in. I wouldn't want to live in that world. But they didn't. They actually had that determination to survive. And I found that so fascinating that really, life is beautiful, can be beautiful. We all know it can be ghastly as well. It doesn't have to be a concentration camp. Sometimes small things can make it ghastly, but it's trying to get up in the morning and believe today will be a better day.
I think that's really interesting what you've said. Actually, what made them, yes, you're right, your family's destroyed, you've got nothing left, you don't know what the future's going to be. You really don't at that point. You've got no idea what, if you're ever going to be rescued. What do you, I mean, did music make them live? Did the music?
No, it wasn't music. Of all the women, there's only one who said that just occasionally she was able to soak up the music, and she was a professional player, but she gave up after the war. Just occasionally she could bury her mind in the beauty of music, but it was ghastly marching music. It wasn't real music.
Oh, right.
And
It wasn't beautiful. Yeah.
the Nazis were exploiting it. I think the answer to the music question is what it did was force them to concentrate, to focus on something else, to block out all the other things. But the question I had in my mind right at the start was, did these women survive because they were a particular breed of strong women? I say women, some of them were girls, but was it their nature that they were strong and that's why they survived? Or should I flip that on its head and say that they survived because they were strong? And I look particularly at the two women I interviewed. One is currently 99, about to be 100, still alive. The other one's no longer alive, but I interviewed her at 99. I mean, what was it about these women that enabled them to survive? And I have to say, I don't really know the answer to that conundrum.
And they didn't really know then. They couldn't really give you, yeah.
Well, Anita Lasker, who's 99 and who I think I have to say chain smokes, so isn't that extraordinary? She says it's luck. And I think to an extent it was luck. When you think of those who didn't survive in Auschwitz, they may have been musical, but perhaps they arrived just before the orchestra started, or perhaps the orchestra was full, or perhaps they wanted to be with their mother and their mother was sent to the gas chamber. They didn't know about the orchestra. There are so many factors that prevented people surviving. We're talking about, more than 1 million Jews were killed in Auschwitz. And I'm talking about a small group of 40 or 50 women who had the good fortune, to put it no finer point than that, to survive.
When you're researching a book like this, and you're obviously coming across some horrible, I mean, we know about Auschwitz, of course, but you're doing, very serious, detailed work rather than just having this sort of idea. How do you not get sucked into it, or do you get sucked into the pain?
I think you do to an extent. I would, there is one piece of music that exists that the main conductor, Alma Rose, recorded with her father. Otherwise, there's nothing else that is available of her playing, even though she was a world famous violinist before she was in Auschwitz. So Alma Rose is or was, I should say, the niece of Gustav Mahler, musical royalty. She wasn't she wasn't brought up Jewish. She was baptized, but according to Nazi rules, she was Jewish. So she ended up in Auschwitz and she conducted this orchestra, and she was responsible for saving the lives. And when I listened to the one recording of her playing with her father, the Bach double violin concerto, I immediately find my stomach going into knots. There is something about that crackly 1928 recording of her and her father, knowing she didn't survive. She's the only one who didn't, but she saved these other lives. That absolutely does it for me. But in answer to your question, how do you write about these appalling experiences without suffering yourself? I think you do a bit. I think you couldn't write it if you didn't. And again, Anita said to me, and I've interviewed her about 4 times, and she said, Anne, whatever you do, don't pretty up this story. Don't talk about it as beautiful music. Don't ignore the fact that for roll call, many of us were standing there starving and yet with diarrhea running down our legs. The smells in the camp were ghastly. So I knew how awful I had to make it, but equally, I didn't want to sensationalize it. I thought it didn't need my adjectives adding to it. It was really sad enough as it was. But there are so many things I can say to you as to how I protected myself. And as I say, to an extent, I didn't, because I don't think you should. Then you'd write something unfeeling. But it's not as if I didn't know about this story. I didn't sort of suddenly discover it. I was born in 1951. I grew up in a Jewish family. My parents had friends for dinner who had numbers on their arm. I remember
Wow.
there's
Oh,
never been a time when I haven't known about the camps. And for research on my previous books, I'd been to 5 other camps, and I always thought I don't want to go to Auschwitz because Auschwitz is the tourist camp. I know Auschwitz. I've been to Buchenwald, Dachau, Theresienstadt, Ravensbrück. I don't, of course, I was wrong. I did need it, and I now think everybody should go to Auschwitz because it's killing on such an industrial scale, and it's unlike anything else. And go now before it completely deteriorates and is no longer there. It is so moving and so impossible to imagine until you've been there. So, I just think we all need to be aware of how the human spirit has this Jekyll and Hyde aspect. These were educated, cultured people in charge of this policy of the greatest sadism and bestiality. The Nazis could love music and use music and then go and kill thousands of people. So I just think one shouldn't shield oneself too much. And certainly as a writer, I don't think that's my role. I need to immerse myself in it. And I want to tell these, I see myself as a storyteller, how important it is.
mm,
And by the way, we're talking today on April the 15th, which is such an important day. It's the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Belsen.
yes.
And the survivors of the orchestra who ended up in Belsen always said this was their new birth date. So you see, that's an
Wow.
example of their optimism.
Yes. It's humbling, the idea that
Truly
you
is.
have that optimism.
I know.
I mean, so when you were growing up, did your parents talk about this? You said there were people that came to dinner parties with with the numbers on their arms. Did they talk about it, or was it something that people didn't want to talk about?
Neither really. We were children, so we didn't talk about it in great detail, but I knew specifically one of my parents' closest friends had lost all her family in the camps. And, that was just said matter of factly. It was just something I knew. And my rabbi was a survivor himself. So, uh, this was to an extent part of our lives. It was neither talked about a lot nor a little. But my parents' lives had been very affected by the war. My parents had been engaged before the war, but my mother at 17 was forbidden to marry by her parents. And so my father had gone off to war and said he thought it was better if they didn't get married in case he left her as a single mother. So my mother was heartbroken, thinking they wouldn't get married. And then during the war, she got engaged to somebody else. And then she discovered, because she thought my father wouldn't survive. And then at the end of the war in 45, she discovered he had. And she broke off the engagement and they did get married. So their lives were so affected by the war that, of course, we talked about that. But we talked about it in very rose tinted terms. It was this great romance that had been interrupted by the war. My father, who drove a tank, when he talked about the Battle of Caen, he said, "It's too ghastly. I can't tell you how ghastly it was. But by the way, I rescued a stray dog that was running around the streets and put the dog in the tank, and we brought the dog back to England at the end of the war." So my version of the Battle of Caen is that my father rescued a dog. Isn't that ridiculous? I mean, that's how
Well,
it was talked about.
but I think that's how we survive. I think that's how we survive. Actually,
Quite,
it's hard to
quite
put into words.
probably.
You know, there's just death everywhere, but you manage to rescue a dog, or you give
Yes.
someone a piece of food. I mean, there's some sense of I managed to save something. Something good came out of this, because all the rest of it is so terrible.
Making sense of our lives. I mean, I think that's how I see, to an extent, my role in writing these books about old people. I love interviewing old people, and most elderly people, when they face the end of their lives, as you say, they want to make sense of it. They want to feel that they've lived life for a purpose, and they may not have talked about their story for years and years, but at the end, they do want to. And I understand that, and I'm thrilled that I can be a facilitator.
You've grown into that, haven't you? Because I remember when the book on Wallace came out. So tell us a bit about that, because obviously this was, well, I don't know if she was alive then or not, but this was some.
No,
Yeah, okay. So was that one of your
well,
first experiences? I mean, that got a lot of publicity, didn't it? Because of people's
yes,
obsession with Wallace.
absolutely. Well, as you say, I'm sort of known for writing about women, and while that is true, I always think the real thread in my books is 1936, when I studied history at university.
Mm,
I especially concentrated on the 1930s. And in 1936, when Hitler marched into the Rhineland, that was the one chance I think the world had to prevent him. He tore up the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a civil war going on in Spain. France had a Popular Front government with a Jewish Prime Minister, Leon Blum, that didn't survive. And what were we doing in England? Around, worried about a king and his morals. So I've always been interested in Wallace from that perspective of world history. But when
mm,
I
mm.
realised that no woman had written a biography of Wallace Simpson, they'd all been written by men in deeply political terms, and I just thought there's probably another side to this story. She's no saint, but is she actually a Nazi, a gold digger, an adulterer, all the rest of it? So I managed to discover her stepson, who she didn't know, because her husband, Ernest Simpson, actually had four wives. And by his third, he had this son who was a free diver in Mexico that nobody had found. And the son had changed his name to Aaron Solomons because Ernest Simpson was actually Jewish and Solomons before he was Simpson. So there was all this backstory that nobody had discovered. And when I flew out to Mexico to meet the stepson, who was a world famous free diver, I discovered different version of the story. I discovered these 15 unpublished letters between Wallace and Ernest, which actually showed she didn't really want to marry the king. She called him Peter Pan. She knew he was, a child who didn't want to face his responsibility, a great big overgrown baby man. And these letters, still pristine in their envelopes, dramatically changed the story. So that took me to a different level. You're absolutely right. But I didn't see myself as a royal biographer.
No.
I saw myself as a biographer of women of history and groups in history. A group biography is much more difficult for obvious reasons.
Yes.
But after that, I wrote about women in wartime Paris because I knew that Wallace and Edward or David or whatever you call
Oh,
him, the
yes,
Duke of
yes.
Windsor, as he became, had
Yes.
spent a lot of time in Paris buying jewelry. So that led on to that book. And that was quite dark because it was Paris in wartime. And from there, I wrote about Ethel Rosenberg, who was electrocuted, convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, and there was no evidence against her. That was actually 1953, so it wasn't 36, but it's the results of wartime. So I guess if there's a thread, it's women in war and how war has affected the perception of women.
And what do you feel that that is? I mean, we were talking about kind of women and courage and loss, because you write a lot about that, don't you? About women's courage and the loss that they face.
It's all those things. I think I love writing about ordinary women in extraordinary times. I mean, one of my very first biographies was about Laura Ashley.
Mm.
And Laura actually joined the Wrens when she was 17 and went to France. And that was the making of Laura. She saw a different world and different possibilities. And the way she could jump out of her social class, which was South London more than it was Wales, actually. There was a Welsh thread to her background. But it was war which gave her the opportunity for social mobility. And I find that very interesting, and it required courage. I mean, she was not involved in fighting, but several of the books I've written about and the history of women reporters, women weren't allowed to report war. You know, they had to stay behind the lines. So they invented their own kind of reporting, which eventually became mainstream. They reported on hospitals and civilian casualties. And now, of course, that is what wars are all about. So women have changed the agenda, and there are more women war reporters than there are men. I think I'm not, I fear I might sound like an advocate for war. I am absolutely the reverse of that. But
Mm.
I find it intriguing to look at the last century, which of course had these two central wars.
Mm.
And I see the Holocaust as the great central calamity. So, how can you write about the 20th century and call yourself a historian if you don't actually face up to this appalling central calamity and
Mm.
how it has affected women? And it has affected women in myriad ways. And I've just been exploring how it has. Women have kept the home front going, and women in World War II were not expected to be involved, so they were able to be active in the resistance. With the Germans thinking that, oh, this is only a schoolgirl, surely she's not doing anything dangerous, but she might have been carrying papers or spying. So um, now I think it's recognized that women are just as courageous, if not more so. One can't generalize, but the women I've written about certainly are. And they may not be household names, but goodness, they should be.
Mm. So we will, yeah, I mean, I think we all need some courage, especially when we face things that we don't expect to happen. And I know that you've had a situation, you were married to your lovely husband, Mark, for decades, and then he sadly died, didn't he? And you,
Yes, very, very suddenly, a sudden heart attack. Um, well, you know, stuff happens. I don't want to make light of it. We were married for 43 years, had three children. I'm lucky to have six grandchildren, so that's very important too. But I'm not alone in being a widow. Heavens, I have a huge circle of widows. It's very sad for Mark. He hasn't grown up seeing the grandchildren. He's missed out on all these things. He was only 69. We never said goodbye. I never said all those things you imagine you'll say if somebody's dying, you know, thank you for this and you've given me a wonderful life and I'll miss that. His last words were, can I have a glass of water? So, you know, there are many aspects about his death that I find tragic for him. On the other hand, he died knowing nothing, and given the lingering, painful deaths that I see so many of my friends going through, he was spared all of that.
Mm.
Stuff happens, you know. If I think of two things in my life that have really made a difference to me, it's certainly losing a husband when I was in my early 60s and not expecting to be single, and how I've just had to pull up my bootstraps and get on with it, because we had a very traditional marriage in that he did all the admin and I did all the domestic stuff. So you just have to take on everything. There's no backstop, you know. You go out of the house, you've forgotten your keys. There's nobody you can make a phone
Wow.
call to. The
Wow.
buck stops with you. So all of that, I've been determined to make myself as healthy as possible. So I'm not a burden on my children, but I'm sure I am or will be. Um, thing is really writing this book because I do treasure each day, and I don't always remember, but I do try and say to myself when I go to sleep, I'm so lucky because every day is a blessing. You know, I've lived this long. I've got all these wonderful things that I see. I know there are terrible things in the world too. I really, really do know that, but I very actively, I probably sound like a therapist, but I do try and write my three special things that happen to me every day, and I don't always do it, and they're sometimes minor, like the tulip bulbs came out today, but I think I found it has helped me to think of, you know, that there are positive things, however ghastly and grim the world is. And the two things that have made me be more positive and active in that are losing a husband at 69 so suddenly, and focusing on a book about a concentration camp where millions died, but some survived. And you know, they did survive at great cost. I think one has to say that it wasn't as if they survived and sailed off into the
Mm.
um, moonlight, because they had troubled lives in the second generation and even the third generation. It was not all over. I mean, Belsen, which we started the conversation talking about, may have been liberated today 80 years ago, but it didn't close until 1950. 5 more years. Although there weren't many people living there were what became known as DPs, or displaced persons. For
Mm.
a long time, they had nowhere to go. They couldn't go back to Poland. Their houses had been destroyed and their families destroyed. They couldn't go back to Germany for the same reason. And Australia, America, and England all had quotas. Where could they go? So some of them wanted to go to British mandated Palestine. Not all, they weren't all Zionists. And anyway, there was a quota in Palestine. So many of them remained in Belsen for months or years. Having suffered so much during the war, they still had nowhere to go. I mean, that would have been a whole other book, and I've devoted one chapter to it because my book is about the war, but I couldn't leave it at the end of the war because it didn't end then.
I think that's really fascinating. And I remember reading The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, and I hadn't really thought about people. The war ends, you think, yay, the war's ended. And then people are
Mm,
flocking across Europe because they're displaced, and people don't have,
yeah,
what do you do if you've got nowhere to go? And imagine having to live 5 years. I didn't know
I
that.
know.
I didn't know
It
that.
it it is unimaginable. And the other woman that I met, Hilda Grunbaum, who was an extraordinary woman of great moral courage. I mean, if anyone was the leader of this group, it was Hilda. The two things that I think about with Hilda are, one, when the Nazis decided that it was the end of the war, the Russians were coming to Auschwitz, they wanted to evacuate and send everybody away. They divided the orchestra again into Christian and Jewish. And they sent the Jewish members on a train to Belsen, and the Christian members eventually had to do a death march to Ravensbrück. I mean, nonsense, isn't it, that here are the Nazis trying to kill Jews, destroy Jewish culture, but at this point they preserved the Jews and sent them on a train to Belsen. Anyway, they had to strip, take off all their clothes, leave everything behind other than prison garb. But Hilda had the guts, the courage to go back into Block 12, the music block, and take the notebook and diary and a volume of Faust that had belonged to Alma Rosé, the conductor I mentioned, contradicting Nazi orders. She could have been shot on the spot, but she did it. She had that historical foresight because she said nobody will believe that this happened. And she took one other artifact, the red bag that she'd carried the music in. She didn't take food or jumpers, practical things. She took these objects because she knew the world would need them. And the other thing about Hilda is that when they were in Belsen, she helped divide the food. She looked after everyone, even if it meant she had less herself. And when she was asked by an interviewer what motivated her, she said, I knew we had to behave better than ever, better than the rest, because if we don't, what's the point of surviving? There's nothing left if we don't show that we are better than everything. And I mean, I could go on about Hilda, but I just wanted to say that I did fly to Israel to meet her when I discovered she was still alive. And I feel so grateful that I did, because she is an inspiration. And I think when I question how did people survive, my mind takes me back to Hilda, and I think she had hope, she had drive. In her case, her hope was Zionism. She hoped that Jews would no longer be killed, that anti-Semitism would end, and that it would end by finding a national homeland for Jews. Make of that what you will, but that was what drove her and what kept her alive and what persuaded her to behave to the best of her utmost ability. And she's a complete inspiration to me.
Yes, I totally hear that. So, I mean, moving forwards, what's going to inspire you? The three things, with my therapist hat on, the three things every morning is, I think, one of the most, it's like doing the morning pages. I think it's really helpful to do that. And then what I like to do is look back at it at the end of the week so I can remember, oh, that happened, or I felt this. And even if you're, I mean, someone said, well, what if you're in terrible pain? And I get that. And I'm not making light of people's spiritual, emotional, and physical pain. I'm like, well, maybe it's just you can wiggle your little toe. It's finding something, isn't it? It's finding something you can attach to, which is this is good. You know, so I think that's very helpful. Goodness knows if that helps if you're in the middle of a concentration camp. I imagine it probably doesn't. But no, I mean, you because you're in such desperate circumstances. That must be very difficult. But for you, when you finished this book, obviously probably quite a while ago because it's out, and please everyone buy it. When do you start doing the next book? Or if you got to the stage now, I mean, you've got 3 children, have you got 6 grandchildren, or are there more? 6 grandchildren.
6.
You said you've got a very lovely, good circle of friends. You keep fit, don't you? You go to the gym. I mean, when does the next book start percolating?
It's really difficult. I want to take a step back, if I may, and just look at what did motivate these women to keep going, because that was one of the things I wanted to try and understand. And there are different motivations. One of them wanted revenge on the people who had betrayed her family. One of them wanted to bear witness to the next generation. One of them wanted to tell her parents who were in hiding what had happened to their son, her brother, and he died, and she felt she had to survive for that. Anita wanted to live for music. She said, whatever else the Nazis did, they can't kill music. So there are different reasons for living, but I think they all said they just wanted to survive till the next day, one day at a time. So that's a mantra one can take, and
Yeah.
just to live until tomorrow and to make today the best day you can. But then to lead on to your next question, what's next in my life? It has to be more than one day at a time. I have to try and look forward. I mean, don't we all need a challenge? I don't know.
Yeah, I think we do. Every time I think, oh, why do you keep doing, this and why that? It's because I guess I like it. I
Well,
stop
I
one.
think when you get to my age, so, the challenge is I'm trying to learn the piano. When I started this book, I learned as a child, but I thought I would learn the piano because that would help me understand how really difficult it was to play music well enough that the Nazis wouldn't say this band is hopeless. And some of these were just kids who'd had 2 years. So I am hopeless at the piano. I have a terribly patient, lovely piano teacher, and I'm still only on grade 3 after about 4 years. But each book takes me 4 years. So I've got the piano. I'm trying to learn how to swim properly. I mean, I can swim breaststroke. I swim in the sea for hours, but I never learn freestyle. So I'm having swimming lessons. I'm learning Greek. I'm
Learning
constantly
Greek as
trying.
well. I'm learning Greek. It's
Yeah,
it's so hard. Why are you learning Greek out of all the difficult languages in the world?
because I have a house in Crete, so to speak to my locals,
Yeah.
and of course they answer me in English. I've been doing that for about 15 years on Duolingo, and I'm hopeless. But there is always a challenge. Climb a mountain, climb a gorge. I am that sort of person. I do need some sort of challenge, but a book is a challenge enough. And will there be another book? Well, it's a great idea. As soon as I have a great idea, I'm a journalist at heart. So are you. You know what it's like. Someone will say to you, I want 10,000 words on X by tomorrow, and you'll do it. And
Yes.
so will I. But I
Yes.
haven't got, if somebody said to me, we want a book on this in 6 months, can you do it? I'd say yes. But you need to be engaged in it. And I've been so obsessed by this, and I do tend to get a bit obsessed by all my subjects. So when I have the right idea, I guess I'll launch in. But for me, it's a 4 or 5 year project. So I'm not going to take on anything if I don't feel that there's a good reason. The world has enough books in it, but it's what I love doing. So if I have the right idea, I will.
And are you a hands-on granny, or are you? I mean, they're going to be in a very different world to us,
Mm.
and sometimes.
I absolutely love being a grandmother. I am very, very lucky, and their age ranges from almost 18 going to university down to 6. So I just saw my 18-year-old grandson yesterday, and he showed me a little trick on Instagram. Isn't that wonderful? Um, I wanted to post something about Belson this morning, and he showed me how to make a draft of it, which I didn't know. So grandchildren have many, many uses. My 3 granddaughters are very close to me as well, and I adore taking them shopping. And actually, they came to Paris with me when I was researching the orchestra book, because the Mémorial de la Shoah, the Holocaust Museum in Paris, had an exhibition on music in all the camps. And we were a bit worried if that was not suitable for kids, but they are so good at absorbing what they need and not taking in too much. And
Mm.
I'm really thrilled. We had that Paris experience together about 4 years ago while I was doing my research. And they've been very involved and understanding about what I'm doing because of that. So I mean, it's just a joy and a pleasure and a delight. And I feel very blessed, what a solace to have these little people growing up and to see what a difficult world they are growing up in.
Yeah.
I'm not envious of their parents having to navigate these paths, but I hope I can be a bit of a backstop, put it no more actively than that.
So you wrote in a piece a while ago that part of your life, of our lives, is the ability to embrace change, or at least be adaptable to circumstances that you don't see around the corner. None of us can really, none of us can see what's coming around the corner. It's not just unless we're Mystic Meg. Do you feel that we're good at this, embracing change, that what you found through your writing, through your life, that part of it is about being able to embrace change before we kind of get engulfed in tragedy?
That's such a huge question. I can't pretend I've got it right at all. I mean, I'm so old that I never learned PowerPoint at school. I still can't do Excel spreadsheets. I'm ashamed of myself for my lack of technical knowledge. But that's not really what you mean by embracing change, although it's part of it, because you do need to be, if you active in the world, you need to be comfortable with technological change. And so, I do have people who help me with when my computer goes wrong and things like that. And I'm learning, and I try to have some plasticity in my brain, hence the piano and the Greek, so that I can cope with these different things. But I think the real change you're talking about is independence and how women are expected, and quite rightly so, to play an active role and not to rely on men. So that makes it difficult for men. I think it's the emotional resilience that is so difficult and that nobody prepares you for. But, we sort of muddle through. Is it more difficult for young men growing up? That's what everybody would tell you if you read anything in the media. But it's what we've fought for as women, to have equal footing, and it's difficult. You can't fight for something and then not like it when it lands on your doorstep. But it comes with difficulties, and I think we're expected to be good at everything these days. It's no good just being good at one thing. You have to be such an all-rounder, because you don't know what skills might be needed of you. So it's tough. And I do feel, as a grandmother with some experience, I can have some sort of cushioning role there. I don't think, in answer to your question, am I an active granny? I don't think my children would say I'm nearly active enough. They could do with a lot more help than I'm able to give them. But I hope that what I do give them is some sort of cushion or backstop. Or I don't want to be the old person who says, "Oh, I've seen it all before," and the next generation is terrible. I love the next generation, and
Yes.
they really inspire me. But I don't think they're going to have an easy world in any way. And maybe activism is required to be active in politics, because we don't like what we see. And from my experience of the 1930s, we need to resist it when we see a political event that we don't like. And it only takes one person both to do good or to ignore evil.
Yes. Yes, I hear
I
that.
don't know. I don't have the answers.
No, well, none of us have the answers, but but we try. And I agree with you, totally agree with you. You can make the choice to be a good person. There's a choice. You can make the choice to do something about it, to be active. It's a choice.
That is the book by my bedside, Viktor Frankl.
Ah.
The one thing that nobody can take away from you is how any individual chooses to behave in a given set of circumstances.
I think that's a very good place, a very poignant place for us to come to an end. Thank you so much, Anne. It's been such a joy and pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you for devoting the time.